Hi, this is a video for Introduction to HL7 FHIR Identifiers, and my name is Terry Sippelschmidt. There's two different types of identifiers in FHIR that are really critical for you to understand, and those are the ones that we're going to go through today. The first is a business identifier, which goes by the element name of identifier. The second is an object identifier, and it goes by the element name of ID. So it's really important that when you see these, you understand the different purposes. The purpose for the business identifier is it's primarily used by people. It's something you're going to see on a computer screen. An object identifier is primarily used by a computer, and it's something that's stored in a database. The other issues surrounding identifiers are not only which identifier element to use, but also is that particular identifier element unique? Business identifiers. If you are a human, all right, the element name, as we mentioned, is identifier. You're going to find this element a lot. You're going to find it in the patient resource, practitioner, organization, and all sorts of other resource definitions. Let's go through one example of the patient identifier, since everyone's familiar with patient IDs, also known as medical record numbers. The purpose of a patient ID or a medical record number is to aggregate all of the patient's healthcare records from all the different, whether it's cardiology and radiology and laboratory and all, into a single folder so that the primary care, the attending is at the time, is able to look at all of the information for that patient, no matter where that patient has obtained their information. Another part of the patient identifier is a type, because there's all different types of identifiers that a patient can have. They can have a medical record number, a social security number, a driver's license number, and about 15 other different types of identifiers defined by HL7. There's also the use or the status of an identifier. It can be official. For example, a medical record number is probably going to be an official medical record number. It can be temporary, however, if the patient came in through the ED and they didn't have identification at the time, and so they had to assign them a temporary medical record number. It can also be secondary. For example, if one health system acquired another health system, and perhaps they chose to sunset one of the EHRs, you probably don't want to completely get rid of that patient's old medical record number from the other institution, but they don't want it to be primary. So they'll retain the number, but they'll label it, the identifier, the status, the use of it, as secondary, just in case they find paper records or something. So in addition to the patient identifier, there's some other resources which have identifiers. For example, we talked about the practitioner resource having business identifiers. In the United States, we have something called the National Provider Identifier. You'll often hear it referred to as the NPI number. The NPI number is going to be the primary identifier at the business level for a practitioner. Other examples include orders. You'll hear an order number, which is usually a 4 or 6-digit number, which you can see on the screen. Let's take a quick glance at a FHIR patient resource. So right here, you can see that we're in the patient resource itself, and the very first element which is identified is that of identifier. The data format for identifier is data format type. It's another resource, which is an identifier. So what's inside of that particular identifier resource? So we already discussed the use and whether it's primary or secondary or temporary. We discussed the type, whether it's a medical record number or social security number or driver's license. But here's where the actual medical record number itself is actually stored. Here's the element of value, and you'll notice it's a string. This is where the number, for example, 365-09-3954, that particular number is actually going to be stored in the element value. However, that number can be duplicated across different healthcare institutions because it is not unique. It's only unique to a particular institution. So in addition to the value, you also need the system or who actually assigned that value and said it was going to be unique within that particular system. You can see that it's defined as a URI or Uniform Resource Identifier. We'll talk about those in a minute. But what they're going to say is the particular uniform resource namespace is going to be an OID, and it'll have a certain set of numbers with it. That is required to be along with this medical record number to know that it's unique. In addition to that, there's also a reference to the assigning organization. So for example, the assigning organization might be St. Joe's Hospital. There's also a period, which is a time period in which this particular identifier is valid. So in our example where one hospital system acquired another hospital system and sunsetted the electronic healthcare record of the original of the acquired system. Perhaps the time period will give a specific date for when that secondary medical record number ceased to be used. So that's how you use period. But the two real things in here that you need to understand are, for uniqueness, you have to have the system who is doing the assigning as well as the value. Quick touch upon national patient identifiers. So some countries like Sweden, Denmark, Ireland, Norway have a national or a nationwide patient identifier so that you don't have to worry about the uniqueness quite as much. However, this national patient identifier is outside the scope of this video, and so we're going to keep moving right along. As a matter of fact, we're going to switch gears. We're going to go from if you are a human to if you are a computer. So what is an instance if you're a computer? In computer science and object-oriented design, an instance is a specific realization of any object. Now in HL7 FHIR, an object is defined as a resource. So an instance is a specific realization of any FHIR resource or template. It's an instantiation. So in other words, now we're not just talking about how to define a patient, but we're talking about a certain patient on a certain date at a certain time with a certain name and a certain address and a certain date of birth. So it's a very specific instance of that patient resource or that patient template. So object or instance identifiers, if you're a computer. Now the element name we're looking at is no longer identifier, now it's just ID. You'll also hear this ID called a object locator or a logical ID. You'll also see the format often written as the name of the resource and followed by an ID, especially if the ID is not globally unique. An ID is less than or equal to 64 characters and it's an alphanumeric string. Each FHIR server has a unique locator which can be used directly, and so you can access a particular instance via the URL path on an API call. So for example, we have, this is a URL, and I can pull out a very specific patient just using this API. So here's my protocol, HTTP, Hypertext Transfer Protocol. Here's my endpoint. So this is my host name or my domain name, which is going to be obviously unique on internet, otherwise internet wouldn't work. So here we have the protocol, host name, and then this gets into the path name and file name. So here we're saying it's a patient, and this long string here is the ID. Now this isn't a UID, this is just a long string to uniquely identify it on this particular server. However, you can see that on one single URL path, using an API call, we can identify the protocol, the host name, and the path to get a specific file. That's something that's really powerful in FHIR. All right, a little bit more on object identifiers or IDs if you are a computer. So often an object identifier will be what's referred to as an OID or an object identifier. Sometimes you'll hear it called a UID or a UUID or a GID, which is a UID is a unique identifier and a GID is a global identifier. ID is just a regular ID is unique to a particular FHIR server at a particular domain name or host name, unless it's a UID. So in the previous example, the example that I gave you, even though it's a long string, it was only unique to that particular FHIR server. You can think of an ID as a primary database key if you took one of the previous database courses. An ID is defined as part of the metadata for every single resource. So how do I actually find, because if you look at patient, you're not going to find an ID element defined in patient or in practitioner or in any other resource because it's kind of hidden. So if you look at the HL7 FHIR resources page, and you look, before you begin to look down here, you look up at the very top, up here you'll see the base resources definition for resource and domain resource. A resource is the basic structure of every single resource in FHIR. A domain resource is the structure for any clinical resource in FHIR. If I come over here and say, what is the definition of a resource? The very first element that you'll see is ID. And if you look over here, it's defined as the logical ID of this artifact, or a better way to have described this probably would have been a logical ID of this instance. You can see it's of data type string. So it's an alphanumeric string, and it'll often include dots or periods, and sometimes dashes. So there are two ways of assigning an ID. It can be a server assigned ID or it can be a client assigned ID. A server assigned ID can be local, a real simple ID, and unique to that server only. So for example, it could start with the number 1, and every time that a new instance is created, just increments by 1. That's completely valid. As a matter of fact, you'll see that on the HAPI-FHIR server. It can sometimes, depending on the server that you're using, use a specific root. So we can talk about the OIDs and the UIDs and the different roots. And sometimes the server will assign a globally unique identifier. The other way that you can assign an ID is you can have the client, for example, an ECG system or an ultrasound system or even a lab test. Sometimes the client, under different use cases, the client may want to assign the instance IDs. They can use a specific root, but if you're going to have a client assigning an ID to be unique on a server, you better do this right, because otherwise, if the client makes mistakes and steps on something that the server's already assigned, things can get ugly pretty quickly. The IDs are assigned as part of the create or the post process. And so anytime that any new instance is created, the server is automatically going to assign an ID unless it comes along with the client definition. Let's talk a little bit about UID and what is a UID root. Whether we're talking about an OID or a UUID or a global ID or universal resource name, let's talk about how you get these things to be unique so that it's a little bit demystified. Here's a UID example from the DICOM standard. If you're not familiar with DICOM is an imaging standard which identifies all the different images that are created around the world, as well as the templates for them. For example, a CT image, or how do you define an MR image or an X-ray image? And so if I look at the root for a UID from DICOM, it's 1.2.840.10,008, and it keeps going after that. Well, the 1 means ISO. So this root is assigned by ISO, which is International Standards Organization. 2 means that it's a member body of ISO. And what that means is that there are different countries which participate at different levels in ISO. The United States is a member body, and 840 happens to be the United States. So ISO in the United States decided to give the root to DICOM as 10,008. So you will see every different UID, which is created by DICOM, will begin with 1.2.840.10,008. something. So how do they keep it unique after that? In this particular example, they say all object definitions are going to begin with 5, and they're going to continue to create what are called components after that. So if I look down here, we've got 1.2.840.10,008.5, and I don't remember what these components mean, but .2 stands for CT image storage. You're going to see .2.1 is enhanced CT image storage. This is the original CT image definition in 1993, and this came about later to deal with things like image stacks and multi-frame images. And then you can also see that there's the 2.2, which is legacy converted enhanced CT image storage. So you can see how anything that goes, once you get to the 2, it probably has to do with CT. However, you're not supposed to try and interpret the different components of this UID. You should just take it and compare it as an entire complete number. In FHIR, if I'm looking at an ID, I went ahead and I pulled an instance off of the HAPI-FHIR server, and you can see that they're telling me that it's a patient resource, and here's my ID, and you can see it's a long number. This is not something that you want to display on the screen of your EHR. Let's talk a bit about namespace and root assigning authorities. Just so that you're aware, HL7 tends to work with OIDs more so than UIDs, but don't worry about it. They're pretty similar and they perform the same role. There is an HL7 OID registry. So if you see an HL7 OID number, you can always just go look it up. The HL7 root, which was defined by ANSI, so it starts with 2, it wasn't just defined by ISO. So 2.16, here's the United States, .840. And you can see down here that the 113883, this is HL7 right here. So if you see this root, you're looking at some HL7 defined OID, and you will find it in this registry. The Uniform Resource Identifier, or URI, has two particular types. One is the Uniform Resource Namespace. And so you can see how HL7 uses URNs to define unique OIDs. Is they're going to say it's a URN. It's an OID. 2.6, you can see the HL7 here. And then these happen to be different states' driver's licenses, Florida, Georgia, Hawaii. So I'm going to guess .4.3 means somehow you get down to driver's license. And then here you've got .12, .13, .15. I'm not sure what happened to 14. But you can see how you begin to create OIDs or unique identifiers. And then finally, the other thing that a Uniform Resource Identifier includes is a URL, or a Uniform Resource Locator. So this was a namespace, this is a locator. So here we can see we have the protocol, we have the host name, as we referred to it earlier, the domain name. Here's a path name. So we're saying we're gonna go to the Happy FHIR server, we're gonna use the release 4 of Happy. And here's our resource name, patient. Now the Happy FHIR server just has a simple increment by 1 algorithm. And so you can see that although the ID is much shorter and more readable, it's still an ID, but it's only unique to that particular FHIR server. All right, let's do a quick recap. There are two primary identifiers in HL7. There's the business identifier, which is the element name identifier, and there's an object or instance identifier with the element name ID. Let's talk about business identifiers again. They're used by people. They're often shown on a computer screen like an EHR or an ultrasound system. An example from the patient resource is the patient ID or the medical record number. That's the business identifier for a patient. They are only unique within a namespace or possibly an organization. To get a unique patient identifier or medical record number, you have to take that medical record number and you have to combine it with the URN or the Uniform Resource Name or the assigning authority to get a unique patient ID or medical record number. Now let's talk about object identifiers or instance identifiers, which are the element name ID. These are used by a computer. They are stored in a database. They identify an instance of a particular resource. You can directly access that instance using the URL format that we discussed earlier. These instances are only unique within a particular FHIR server unless someone is really going out and using a UID or an OID root system. And then finally, the ID can be server or client assigned. Typically, it's going to be server assigned. If the client chooses to assign an ID, they better be careful. And on that note, have a great day, and we look forward to seeing you in class.